Oh, hey, CNFers, if you want signed, personalized copies of The Front Runner for the holiday season, you're running out of time for the holiday season, but if you want to go beyond, you can email me, creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com, and I will email you a PayPal invoice, or you can mail me a check so PayPal doesn't skim off a fee. And I'll ask you how you want your book personalized and signed. It'll be $30 total, and that covers that prime media rate shipping. Next day delivery, pish posh. Try next 10-day delivery while supplies last. And boy, are they lasting. This podcast is sponsored with this house ad by Pitch Club, the monthly Substack where you read cold pitches and hear the authors audio annotate their thinking throughout that pitch. How they sold it and crafted their pitches that landed publication. Don't we all want that? It's pretty rad. I'm going to feature myself soon. Yeah, I landed one. Well, it could get killed still. So if it doesn't get killed, you better believe I'm going to feature the owner of the club. Welcome to Pitch Club. Welcome to pitchclub.substack.com. And lastly, this podcast is also sponsored by the word toxic, not the Britney Spears song, but toxic, relating to or being an asset that has lost so much value that it cannot be sold on the market, as in a career in journalism, is toxic.
Especially in the investigative space, it's like once you do investigative stories, it's like people want to just talk to you and tell you more things.
Oh, hey, CNF. This is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I talk to tellers of true tales about the true tales they tell, about the art and craft of telling true stories, whatever. It doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Not the pebble in your shoe exactly, but the feeling when the pebble falls out. Seth Wickersham is back. Oh, yes. He's an ESPN.com senior writer, investigative reporter, and New York Times best-selling author of It's Better to Be Feared, and most recently, his best-selling American Kings, a biography of the quarterback. It's published by Hyperion. I had never seen quite a book promotional engine as the one surrounding Seth's book. He was doing major book interviews in July, 2 months ahead of publication. Naturally, he continued through the fall, but it was a loaded spring, a loading of the spring I had never really witnessed before, and I pay a lot of attention to how we, as writers, beg for attention. I remember thinking this is perhaps the most aggressive publisher publicity push to get this book on that coveted New York Times bestseller list I had ever seen, and it worked. A lot of resources pumped into that. Deservedly so, but you can start to you see the math out there. And it's also on just about every year-end best book list, which I have thoughts about. The lists, not American Kings. How is it that so many of these best books come out in the final quarter of the year? It's just like the Oscar campaigns, isn't it? Oh, okay, you know what? I wasn't going there. I'm not going there. Show notes to this episode and more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, bookmark it so you can browse for blogs and sign up for the 2 very important newsletters, the flagship Rage Against the Algorithm and Pitch Club. Welcome to pitchclub.substack.com. Also, if you care to support the podcast with a few dollar bills, visit patreon.com/CNFpod. Been quipping over there. If you know, you know. It's probably where I'll host the hashtag Flash52 sessions. These will be little writing sprints, about 30 minutes or so. And, as I try to write up maybe 52, as many as 52, Flash essays this year. Hopefully I'll land a few. Plus, just imagine how much you'll be helping me out, the podcast, and other writers by joining the CNF and Patreon community. If you think each podcast is worth 50 cents to $1 a week, think about it. Give it a try. Okay, so Seth is back. We had a tight window to get this interview done. It was 30 minutes of raw interview time, and after the edit, it ended up being closer to 25. Yeah, he was gassed from a big publicity push, big campaign. I think he did this as a favor since I'd been on his ass since July about this book. Well, mainly on his publicist's ass. Then I had to go over their heads. I keep podcast receipts, man. I keep the receipts. Sidebar. Sometimes I think tight interviews are great. Tony the Tiger level great. You can't quite cover as much ground as you get into the the granularity of certain things, but there's still so many great takeaways from this episode, even though it's half as long as the huge. Seth talks about getting to the heart of the matter, interviewing versus conversations, and how he bristles at the conversation angle, establishing trust, writing out questions but being okay with deviating, how doing all this book promotion is just pennies in the bank, and fuck, wouldn't you know they're not even minting pennies anymore. His relationship to quarterbacking, how he vetted the main quarterbacks he featured in American Kings, and how the quarterback is a vector for American ambition. And I tell you, Seth is one of the good guys. Strike that. He's one of the great guys. You can't say that about everyone. He's a heavy hitter. He's steady in the pocket. And his eyes are always downfield, man. Parting shot on how I'm nudging the podcast in a different direction, but a good direction. Don't worry about it. It ain't video. Trust me, it's not that big a deal. But that, oh my God, but you want to know, don't you? Ha. Cue up the montage. Riff.
Don't ask this question. Don't go there.
The structure should be as simple as it possibly can be.
I think email is like the death of all of all creativity.
This is going to have to interest somebody somewhere other than me.
It's all grind.
Yeah.
I think book promotion is like pennies in the bank. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like you keep thinking, you're gonna like hit one thing that'll take care of it for good, but really it's like pennies in the bank. It used to be as like if you got an NPR and you knew you were set, right? That was like 20 years ago. And now there's no such mechanism. Like I said, I don't know. It feels like we're all just kind of like going kind of blind, and that's definitely including publishers and their marketing and PR people.
Yeah, I know some of the discussion around trying to gin up any kind of momentum for the front runner, and I don't think it was particularly successful, was trying to get it in the hands of running influencer types on Instagram and TikTok. And like one coach picked it up and shouted it out, and like that is kind of like the status thing now versus like a nice review in the New York Times or something, which might stoke our egos, but actually the influencers shouting out a book might actually have more influence than the traditional paths.
It's absolutely true. Absolutely true. And it's easier on the consumer. You know what I mean? Like it's literally like a transaction that lasts 5 seconds. You know what I mean? So.
Oh yeah. Yeah, 100%. It's wild. And so I just doing the grassroots thing, for me, just trying to hook up with running groups and stuff like that. It's a pretty simple audience to point it towards and be like, and once I get it in their hands, hopefully, runners tend to be readers too. So it's just like, yeah, check this out and maybe tell your friends, buy 2 copies or something.
Totally, right. Buy like 8.
Exactly. Don't be shy, everyone.
Yeah. Everyone was always like, I can't wait to read your book. I was like, just buy it. Like, if you read it, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, it doesn't expire. It's not going to spoil.
Anyway, I'm ready when you are. Starting
off with some kind of crafty components around this. And just as a reporter and journalist and writer, I heard Dan Patrick this morning talking about certain NBA players, and they weren't necessarily great at various things, but they knew what they were very good at, and they just lean into those strengths and identifying those strengths. And I love pulling on that thread for writers and reporters too, because it's so multidisciplinary, and we all have our strengths and weaknesses under that milieu. So just for you, Seth, like, what do you identify as something that, I'm particularly good at?
I think that. And even after doing this for 25 years, it's weird because I know I can do it. Right. I feel, I've done, some books and some high profile stories, and yet, you still wonder like, well, what am I actually good at, in this thing? I think that like, if there's one thing, I think that I'm good at telling stories, I think, that get to the heart of the matter. And so I think that like it takes on a little bit of different shape in magazine writing form versus book writing form. But I think that like no matter what it is, you compile all of this material about your character, and then I think, you try to, see, what are the things that are the most relevant that you've learned? What are the things that get at, what it is that, the story you try to tell, or how you see the character, or whatever it is. That process, it's not a clean process for me, but I think that process of trying to like winnow away at, binders worth of material for a book into a book, I think that's something that through trial and error mostly, I think I've figured out a way to do. And I think that when you're writing a book, you just want to stick to the essentials as much as you can. I think that like everybody has enough material for 2.5 books.
Yeah.
And, as much as you want to like share, I think that like you kind of like want to tell the best story you can in a way that respects the reader's time, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that like those would be the things. I think that like, when I'm looking at a character, I think that like once I figure out the essence of what I'm trying to tell about them, I can figure out how to see everything within that context pretty quickly.
Yeah, and getting to the heart of the matter and what is essential to
Mm-hmm.
the heft and the animating force of a magazine story or a book, it can be challenging to sometimes tease those threads out from your
Mm-hmm.
sources and everything. So how have you over the years just engendered what Isabel Wilkerson might call some of that accelerated intimacy, so you do get beyond the fluff and get to the good stuff?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think that like, if you've been doing it for a while, you might have, some notoriety or a reputation. And, what's weird is that like, especially in the investigative space, it's like once you do investigative stories, it's like people want to just talk to you and tell you more things. And so in a weird way, it's like, I wouldn't say it becomes easier because it's never easy, but like in a weird way, it can be more efficient because you kind of break down the barriers of who you are. You know what I mean? I think that like, especially in some of the investigative stuff on the NFL I've done, it's a pretty insular and static group of people. I mean, like, owners don't change hands very often. Team presidents don't change hands very often. League executives, there's some turnover, but not very much. So I think you're pretty much always dealing with the same amount of people. So they kind of know you, whether that you actually know them or not. On a more fundamental level, I think that like, you can gain that accelerated intimacy or trust a couple different ways. I mean, I think that like number one, you can be the type of personality that people want to be around, and you can bet on your personality at times. And I think that like usually you can pull that off, but often, but sometimes you can't, or whatever it is. I think that it was, when was it exactly? I'm going to say it was like 5 or 6 years into my career at ESPN. ESPN hired this man named John Sawatsky, who was an interview expert. And they made everybody who, whether it was a producer or a quote unquote talent, anybody who had a chance to compose questions or ask them of subjects, they made people take his class. It was a truncated version of it, but he got a lot of like pushback. He's a really, really smart guy, but his presentation style kind of offended a bunch of people who had been doing things a certain way for a long time. But his methodology is geared towards producing the best answers. And it's actually very simple and logical. And I got a lot out of it. And, it's kind of based, your listeners can go and look at it, but it's kind of based on asking questions. He has these rules: lean, open, neutral. Lean as in short questions. Open as in who, what, when, where, why. Neutral as in avoiding words that might become issues within themselves. So like, you have a wife. If your wife ever says, if you ever say to your wife, how is your day? She might, answer how she sees the answer. But if you say, did you have a bad day? She'll seize on the word bad. And so there's a subtle difference there. And I think that like, it really helps to follow his methodology. And, what I found is that like when you do that and you kind of try to adhere to those principles as best you can, his other strategy is to start broad with questions and narrow from there based on the answers that people give. So you're constantly asking lean, open, neutral questions that start broad and then narrow, and you're asking more lean, open, neutral questions based on their answers. And so when you do that, I find that it tells the subject that you're actually listening to them very intensely, and you're asking questions based on the things that they say, and that accelerates trust and intimacy, I think, in a better way than kind of betting on your personality or by, learning how to kind of, be friendly. They always see these people as like, oh, I interview, I have conversations. Like, I don't like that. There's moments that can be conversational, but I generally don't like that because both the subject and that you're there for a reason, and you're there to learn about this person that you're around. And so I think that, like, own it. You know what I mean? Don't pretend that you're friends. Like, ask these questions, listen intently, ask follow-up questions based on it. That to me is the best methodology to really establish trust, and also show the person that you're writing about that you're interested in hearing about the things that they have to say, rather than kind of introducing your prejudices or biases into it. Long answer, but that's it.
Oh, that's beautiful. And when we last spoke, you had brought up Swarovski at the end of the conversation.
Yeah.
I went on like a real deep dive with him, and it really helped inform a lot of the prep I do. And I even have like a kind of like a coach call sheet I devised.
Yeah, that is a coach call sheet.
Yeah, and it's got columns that prompt me like with what, hows, and whys and whens to make sure that I am being as lean and open ended as possible with the line of questioning, if you will. And I have an interviewing question to pose to you too. Is just like, to what extent or how much prep do you do versus going with the flow of the conversation to get where maybe you ultimately want to go?
So Zawadzki sort of has a philosophy for this too, and I found it helpful. So I think that, like, you want to have an outline of what you want to learn, right? So if I'm interviewing John Elway for my quarterback book, he's 62 years old on the day that I'm interviewing him. So he's lived a lot of life. I can't cover his entire life with him. You know what I mean? Like so what I want to do is pick the topics that I want to learn the most about. And there was different themes that I had. So, like, I wanted to learn kind of like when, his origin story. Why did he become a quarterback? And then, pressure, fame. He was the first quarterback who was the number one player in the country, first pick in the draft, first ballot Hall of Famer. So I knew intuitively that, like, if you survive that, that's a lot of pressure. It does something to you. So, like, I had an arc of what the things I wanted to learn. And so you structure questions in a way that gives you like a loose roadmap to try to learn those things. And, you want to try to be ready to understand when a turning point comes up so you can capitalize on that, because it's change. And anytime we write a story, you need change. You know what I mean? Like, I think that helps quite a bit, especially if it's organic change. The second thing, though, is that no matter what, if you're sitting with someone, they're going to surprise you. They're going to say something that was unintended, something that you weren't prepared for, something that was new. And you have to decide whether you deviate and go down that rabbit hole. And so, generally speaking, those are the ways that I think about interviewing. I definitely organize topics. I have questions written out. I don't always ask them all, but I think as an exercise, it's good to kind of like have your brain thinking along those lines. And then again, when the subject says something new or different, if it's something that you want to capitalize on, be ready for that. So if John Elway says, I played quarterback, I started playing quarterback when I was 13, but I really knew I could be a good one at age 14. So why was that? You know what I mean? So that might be something I wasn't quite ready for. What happened when you were 14? And then follow-up questions for that from there.
And how did you approach the curation of the quarterbacks that you prominently featured in American Kings?
Yeah, so that was a good lean, open, neutral question there. How did I do it? So I did 2 books that weren't, or they were like binders, but like, so I researched every quarterback in the Pro Football Hall of Fame and read as much as I could about them and wrote like a bio sketch based on the things that interested me about their story. Then I also did the same for the College Football Hall of Famers. And then I did the same for quarterbacks who weren't in the Hall of Fame but were important. You know, Michael Vick, you know, for instance, or Jim Plunkett, whatever it might be, you know, these guys who, you know, they matter even if they weren't great. So then, you know, I did a bunch of research about the history of the quarterback, not of the forward pass, but of the quarterback, and, you know, the moments that kind of reflected, you know, American culture and gay. And so if you're looking at how the quarterback started from a position that handed off in the 1880s to, you know, now where it's a lofty American cultural job, what were the touchstone moments that did that? And how did they reflect what was going on in the country at the time? How did, you know, American culture at the time open up something for quarterback to kind of come through and take advantage of? So like I had all of that stuff mapped out. And then I think that like what I did was I picked the stories that were either stories that personally interested me. So like I knew I was going to tell John Elway's story. I knew I was going to tell Warren Moon's. I knew that Steve Young was going to be a big component because of the way that he talks about quarterbacking and how philosophical he can be. Then there was guys who culturally had to be part of it. So like Bob Waterfield in the 1940s, Johnny Unitas, Joe Namath, like guys like that who like you cannot tell the story of quarterbacking without getting into them at some point. And then there was other guys who were in interesting situations, even if like as characters, I didn't, you know, I wouldn't have done them standalone, but their situation was interesting. So Caleb Williams looking to blow up the draft, to maybe give himself some agency over his employer. Arch Manning and the recruitment of Arch Manning and how it's the most intense recruitment in, you know, college sports history, as a way to also let you talk about the Manning family. And then this guy, Colin Hurley, who's at LSU, who wanted to, you know, he was 14 when I met him, and he wanted to be, you know, on the fastest track possible, the most precocious of the precocious. And so I used him to kind of tell the story of what it's like to be a high school quarterback nowadays. So that's a bloated answer, but that's how I picked them.
Right. Yeah. It's throughout the course of the book, like to me, like a theme, and this is my own projection of it too. It just struck me as here's this very coveted position in the American culture and certainly in American sport. But there are costs and consequences to taking on the burden of quarterback. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the big capital A abouts of this book. And when does a theme of a capital A about of that nature kind of reveal itself to you over the course of your research and reporting?
Honestly, it was ingrained from the beginning because I played a bit of quarterback in high school and I knew enough about it to know that and I also played other sports, and I knew that quarterback was just fundamentally different. Like you don't play it, you are a quarterback. Steve Young and I sat down and I asked him, like, what are all the titles, you know, what are all the hats that a starting quarterback for an NFL team has to wear? Yeah. And, you know, he goes into field general, matinee idol, spokesperson for a multi-billion-dollar organization, amateur psychologist, chief cheerleader, breathtaking asshole, all these things. And so, like, fundamentally, it was always different. And how did it become that way? And so, and then I kind of knew, you know, throughout my career of just observing it and writing about it, but also wanting to tell it at a deeper level, that, like, it takes a certain hardwiring to go from one of 16,000 starting quarterbacks in high school every year to 958 at the highest level of college, to 32 in the NFL, to 10 being one of the 10 good ones, to being one of the 3 Hall of Famers in any given year. I knew that surviving that winnowing, that filtering, you know, you do things to yourself that are incompatible with life without football. So, like, I always knew that was the arc that I wanted to follow. You know, one of the things that I really tried to show was how the intensity that we place on quarterbacks, especially youth quarterbacks nowadays, turns them into something that, like, can be really difficult. Like when I was at Elite 11, which is one of the highest profile quarterback showcases for high school guys, one of the longtime people there was like, look, we're just breeding little assholes. And, these are like, 16, 17 years old. And so I think that like those themes I wanted to introduce early and show how they get formed at a young age, and then what it is like to live with them throughout life. Those, I think that to be a quarterback you have to be a little delusional.
Yes.
You have to kind of believe that you're special. I think you have to believe that like there's so much pressure and criticism and scrutiny on you that I think that to enter a game without feeling doubt, you kind of have to somewhere believe that you're superior to the teammates, to the coaches, and whatever it might be, and a little aloof. That to me was really fascinating because I really believe it's an essential part of the job. And I also believe it's one of those things that really corrupts people on the other end when they're not playing football. Yeah, I'm not sure it's reversible. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And one of the more tragic moments in the entire book, and it revealed the Macbethian cost of ambition, really, was it's really just a 36-word passage, about 3/4 through the book. And it's when Caleb Williams texts his dad, I need 8, after Tom Brady's retirement. And, you break it off, it's 36 words, it stands on its own. And to me, like that summed up the curse and the almost infectious disease nature of the position, meaning he needed 8 Super Bowls for him to really to be the greatest. And to me, I found the sickness of the quarterback was very prevalent in that passage alone, and it's very tight and punchy. But I don't know, I just wanted to get your sense of maybe what you thought of that when that came across your ledger and you're like, wow, that is some pathology right there.
Well, it is, and it's also like it's the bar that's constantly being raised, for these guys. And so, and they often are doing the raising themselves. And I think that like, as much as it's a book about quarterbacking, it's a book about American ambition and the perils of it. And I think that like you see some of the perils of it in the book, where you see guys who struggle with the game and without the game, like Colin Hurley, the last chunk of the book with him, he's in the ICU. Because he goes to college at age 16, which is far too young to go to college, but he's a good enough player that he's second string at LSU. And he has a car because of NIL money, and he has an apartment off of campus because of NIL money. And his dad, Charlie, who's like a fascinating guy, and he's like a well-meaning hard ass, but he's very intense throughout the entire book and kind of your classic quote unquote quarterback dad. But you see as the book goes on that a lot of the things he was really worried about, the premonitions that he had, came to be true when, Colin ends up running his car into a tree at 3:00 in the morning and ends up, not knowing if he'll live. Again, it's like, these are all things that, when I was talking about earlier about trying to get to the heart of the matter, you have to look at the essential pieces of reporting that you have that reveal something about the characters you're telling them, and then how it ties into the job. And almost everything, quarterback is such a way of life that almost everything that happens in a quarterback's life ties back to this job that they had and what they had to do and build within themselves to do it.
Yeah, and you brought up earlier, and you start the book with your personal story and your personal arc as a high school quarterback, and being that and wanting so desperately to be that guy. Over the years, even though long after having not played the position, but how much of your identity is still in some way tethered to the ideal and the idea of quarterbacking?
Well, it never left me, even though I obviously am not a quarterback, but like, there's something inside again that like, it just doesn't really go away. And I knew if I went through that as a high school kid in Anchorage, Alaska, not trying to sound like the Alaska Uncle Rico here, but if I went through that, then, just imagine what it would be like for some of these guys who do it at the highest level. Like at the early stages of the book, I was reporting this Andrew Luck story about why he walked away. So I spent a shitload of time with him. But, the constant theme that was kind of emanating from our conversations was self-identity, and that, everybody wanted to know, like, why was it that he walked away from professional football at age 29 at the peak of his powers? And like, that was interesting. But the real question is, like, what did that decision do to him? And who did it turn him into? Because for his entire life, he was a quarterback. And then all of a sudden he was not. And he was still dealing with the aftershocks of that decision years after the fact when we were together. And so those were the things that kind of, were the powerful facts and ideas that drove a lot of the book.
Yeah, and there's a revelatory moment towards the end where you run into, your friend Aaron from high school, and it's like you had put so much blame on yourself for not being able to embody the position, but he's just like, we couldn't block for you. You had no chance. Like, just in that moment, did you feel a lightness that you were absolved of the blame for not taking the ball?
And it's so embarrassing. So, like, the book is not a morass of my career as a quarterback, but my morass as a quarterback informs it a lot. So later, as I was reporting the book, I got drinks with a friend who played center on our high school team, and I was sitting there with him, and I'm like, don't ask this question. Don't go there. Like, nobody, like, you're in your 40s. Like, do we really need to do this? And, even though I've seen a million, Springsteen concerts where he plays Glory Days, and even though I think I've adhered all the lessons of it, I still couldn't help it. And, I do ask him, like, why do you think I didn't make it as a quarterback? And, his answer was very swift and declarative. And it did allow me to kind of, like, I don't know if I felt lighter, because it wasn't like some psychological thing that was weighing me down. But, I think that, like, it reminded me something about that's essential to the job. And that's that it is interconnected, and its success is dependent on other people. And even though you might think, I failed or whatever it might be, the truth of that might be a little bit more complicated and nuanced.
Knowing what you know about quarterbacks and what it does and on every level, would it be something you would still sign up for?
I asked that of Joe Namath. At the end of the book, I asked him that exact question. But I will say that, like, Namath has lived a little bit more life through that lens than I have. My answer is absolutely. You know what I mean? Like, I remember, like, I always look back to my years quarterbacking, and they had this cloud over them. Like, I had not lived up to my potential, or I had not lived up to what I wanted to do. And I remember talking to someone, and they were like, look, you got to do this cool thing, this very unique experience. You got to do it for a couple years. Like, how cool is that? And I never had really thought to look at it through that kind of glasses half full lens.
Well, that's really well put. And the book's a masterpiece. And I read it back in July, and I have so many things underlined, comments in the margins, sticky notes sticking out of the whole friggin' thing. It looks like a psychopath read the book, and I guess you could say that's partially true. It's such a great book, and I'm so glad to have read it and get to speak to you about it. So just thanks for the time.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I'll take, a psychopath ripping through your book as a compliment, so I'll take it that way. Thanks, man.
Yes. Pretty cool, right? It's always nice when people come back on the show once they've been on once or twice before. That's always validating. It's always fun because you can get to, like, different levels, and you have a rapport, man. I feel like I have a rapport with Seth. In any case, it was a tighter interview, but that's what I call concentration. We reduced the sauce, man. That's what I call a 2-minute drill. Thanks to Seth for throwing ye old CNF pod a bone. A little pass out into the flat. And we took it, and we ran. We got like 6 yards, but it's all right. Maybe we moved the sticks. I don't know. Even though it's the best podcast of its kind, ye old CNF pod, it can be hard to convince some of these big publishers that their great white shark should patrol your waters. To that I say, flog 'em. Seth is the best, though. I'm very happy to call him my best friend now. Yes, I know how to make it weird. I have a quick QB story. So, my dad played quarterback for Acadia University in Nova Scotia, Canada. So even though I was more entrenched as a soccer player, when I was 12, he signed me up for football. And I don't remember. Maybe I expressed interest in it. I can't remember that much. I have to talk to him about it. I thought it could be fun. I really wanted to be a running back. Yeah, I was a pretty fast runner, and I was always a bit on the thicker side. I could have been a penny store Jerome Bettis, maybe the VW bus. If Bettis was called the bus. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But I guess my dad told the coach, Coach Walsh, put him in at quarterback. I about had a panic attack because I had a hard time remembering some of this new technology, A gaps and B gaps, whatever. And most everyone had been playing Pop Warner for a few years, so they were already comfortable at the speed and motion of the game. And I quit after 3 practices. I called the coach on the phone. Shout out to 12-year-old B.O. for calling the coach. And said, and I quote, "I'm not ready to play quarterback." It was kind of a spineless way to say I wanted to quit, but I was like, "I'm not ready to play." And he said, "Well, I think you are." And I said, "I'm going to stick with soccer." And I did. And I was an okay soccer player, but I wasn't built for it, to be a really, really great one. But I was okay. Anyway, what I should have said was, I just really wanted to keep, if I really wanted to keep playing, was that I prefer to be a running back, but instead I took the easy way out and just quit. Now look at me. All right, the real gag of it all was the person who then stepped into whatever hapless void I left behind would become the eventual varsity quarterback of the high school, and more or less a grade A douchebag, and a politician in Massachusetts, and just an all-around unenjoyable person. The gag is that I unleashed a monster on Massachusetts by quitting football at age 12, and thus he became a quarterback. And as Seth talked about in this episode, QBs are just, you're grooming assholes, the future assholes of America. That said, this guy and I, we were always cool. We grew up playing baseball and all that stuff. So, and I never had much by way of enemies. He didn't become a total goon until after college, but I haven't seen the guy in close to 30 years, so who the hell knows? All right, here's the real parting shot, and it has to do with some increased structure to the podcast, and not necessarily an overt structure where the structure is blatantly broken up into chapters, but more for my own organization. Okay, so I routinely draw up a call sheet, not unlike a football coach. Those laminated cards that are color-coded and provide situational plays depending on down and quarter and distance, etc., whatever. I say it like I know what I'm talking about, but I kind of know what I'm talking about. To keep my call sheet organized, it's just a piece of printer paper I fold into 3 columns or 4 columns. It's to keep my questioning as lean and open-ended as possible. It's so I write down, like I said, those 3 columns, but it broken up into what's, whys, hows, and whens. It's just a prompt for me to make sure I don't get too long-winded with questions. Keep it lean and keep it open-ended. And I color code based on super important questions I need to ask. Then others are based on crafts or routines, and of course the work at hand. If there's a work at hand, that must be promoted. I also have several questions I have there so I can effectively pivot based on answers the guest is giving, so I can keep advancing the ball. I really love these football metaphors for constructing an interview podcast that lasts 60 raw minutes, 15-minute quarters. But it's all jumbled together, and sometimes I lose the thread. Given that I record for 60 minutes, I'm experimenting with breaking the interview basically into 4 quarters or 4 phases. Craft and advice, process and routines, general malaise, and the work at hand, be it a book, an article, whatever. Under these major categories will be my lean, open, neutral questions broken up by category so I don't lose track of them, as I have done numerous times in the past. Keep it personal, practical, and tactical. People like to know a writer's connection to the work, how they do it, and how they deal with the usual crummy feelings of doing this kind of work. And practical advice for doing the work in the face of great resistance and self-doubt. And tactical things that you can play with, be it a certain kind of notebook or spreadsheets or waterproof things or books and binders and bags, file systems, cocaine. Just kidding on that last one. But for someone who has never done or never will do cocaine, I sure like joking about it. It's a fun word to say. Also, while I never share questions with guests, I can say, like, these are the 4 phases of the interview. You know, if they're not unfamiliar with the show, like boom, 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 boom. I kind of sort of do this instinctually, but I'd like to have it more intentional on my end. And that's how I can think. That's how I think I can maintain the core ethos of the show, but improving it in a way that kind of streamlines each section and it has like more of a logical progression to it. You know, no video, that's for sure. There will come a day when people will swing back to audio instead of this pathological push to video. Like, remember the days, you know, podcasts were meant to be listened to on audio. In a real candid moment, you know, Rob Harvilla of his 60 songs that explain the 90s of The Ringer doesn't want to be on video for his Ringer work. But since they are now owned by that vile Spotify company and have been for a while, their video push is upsetting and defeats the spirit of this medium. You know, make TV shows if that's your thing, but get out of my audio lane. And not everyone is meant to be on camera. Am I right? I know what lane to stay in. So stay wild, CNFers, and have a nice holiday week if you celebrate this major holiday coming up. This is the penultimate podcast of 2025, so let's get ready and douse this year in gasoline and light it up. If you can't do interview, see ya.